Now there's work to be done. We have to put these reports out. And then manifold to infinity. Hello Anglophonians, and welcome to another episode where we take a look at European comics. And for today we return to The Little People. This story is called The Little Man Who Laughed, and I pointed out that Seron, the creator of The Little People, had created their stories as if they were living in some sort of utopia. Well, in this episode we see that the utopia is not quite utopian as they thought, because they are missing something.
This sculpture, located in Florence, Italy, is entitled In Search of Utopia. Strictly speaking, a utopia is the draft of a possible future but mostly fictitious way of life or social order that is not tied to contemporary historical cultural framework conditions. The term itself is derived from ancient Greek ou, not, and topos, place. Mixed together, non-place or a non-existing place. The fictitious social orders described in utopias result from critique of the respective contemporary social order and can be read as positive counterdrafts. For Thomas More, the founder of the genre, the term is a language game between utopia and eutopia, from eu, good, and topos. In contrast, dystopia describes the pessimistic description of an unethically negative social disorder. In everyday language, utopia, especially as an adjective utopian, is used as a synonym for a vision of the future that is predominantly considered beautiful but unfeasible by the predominant social groups. With regard to their feasibility, a distinction is made between descriptive, apparent future trends describing, evasive, with the tendency to escape from the world, and constructive, to be actively realized utopias. These can relate to government and economic forms, the future of culture, art or religion, different ways of living together, innovations in the educational system, or gender constellations, etc., etc. As for The Little People, we are pretty much in the area of evasive utopia here, since the basic premise of the story was that humans were reduced in size by a mysterious meteoroid and forced to adapt to the new life. They have decided to live for themselves and hide from the rest of humanity, the big ones. But there is only one town of little people, and the number of experts there is limited. The story, The Little Man Who Laughed, begins with Renaud discovering that there are no mushrooms left in the warehouse. Now, the little people can live on a relatively small amount of mushrooms. That's not the problem. But the gardener in charge of the mushrooms is sick. It is a very strange disease, and the little people's doctors are puzzled. The gardener laughs all the time. Nobody and nothing gets him out of his fit of laughter. The doctors have to admit that they are not qualified for such a case. One of them comes up with the idea that a certain Dr. Hondegger, a luminary in his field, might be able to help. The only problem is, Hondegger is a big one. He lives a little away from the town of the little people. There is a back and forth discussion, but then the little people decide to contact Hondegger despite the possible danger. They try the phone first, but Hondegger tells them he needs to see and examine the patient. The little people set up a meeting, and Hondegger is understandably extremely confused when he sees them. But the mysterious laughter disease is challenging his mind, so he promises to help. Since the little people can't come to his practice all the time, he decides to set up a tent near their town and bring his equipment there. This in turn calls the military into action, because the old cistern where the little people live is on military territory. So Honecker and the little people have several problems. They have to help the poor gardener with his illness and at the same time arouse as little suspicion as possible, so that the military does not find the town of the little people. What was Seron's inspiration for the story? A good question, because there is not much information about it. The original title is Le Petit Homme qui rit, which reminds one quite directly of the title of Victor Hugo's novel L'Homme qui rit. L'Homme qui rit, translated The Man Who Laughed, was published in 1869, almost 40 years after his most well-known work, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The novel is set in England in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Even the introduction is unconventional because there are two. First, a philosophizing jester named Ursus is presented, an outwardly grumpy and shy misanthrope. Second, we get to know the so-called comprachicos, who, like Ursus, roam the country buying or kidnapping children and then horribly mutilating and disfiguring them for the amusement of others. In January 1690, Ursus takes in a neglected 10-year-old boy. His name is Gwynplaine. He is holding a little girl who's almost a year old. The boy had been abandoned on the coast by the comprachicos fleeing England, and he had found the girl on his frozen mother's corpse on his march through snow and storms. Ursus goes from fair to fair with the children. Gwynplaine is the terrifying sensation. In fact, the comprachicos put a smile on his face. He is masked with his own flesh. The little girl becomes a beautiful young woman named Dea. But she's blind, so she can see the ever-grinning Gwynplaine. But that's why she can love him. Okay, so it looks like Victor Hugo didn't have much to do with the inspiration for this story. L'Homme qui rit is a very clear simile to the phrase "love is blind." And story-wise, Hugo may have inspired Batman's Joker rather than a comic book about a little man suffering from laughing sickness. There is, however, a far more mundane explanation. Either Seron just saw the title of Hugo's story and made something out of it, or he was inspired by advertising. In France, there is a cheese brand called La Vache qui rit, the cow that laughs. Why is there a laughing cow on a piece of cheese? The motif goes back to the French illustrator Benjamin Rabier, who decorated military trucks with the image of a laughing cow during World War I. This picture was called the Vache qui rit, an allusion to the mythological figure of the Valkyrie, who became world famous through Richard Wagner's operas. The naming was intended to satirize the use of Wagner in German wartime propaganda. Rabier met the cheese manufacturer Léon Bell, with whom he teamed up. La Vache qui rit started in 1921. It was an industrial product in a time when agricultural products were still mainly handcrafted and sold. The concept, packaging and marketing were new territory in many respects. The cheese was mainly intended for children, who should be given special attention. La Vache qui rit is one of the best-known brands in France today. Almost 95% of the French people know it. And what can make you think Seron was inspired by advertising? In one of the next stories about his little people, Seron smuggled in an advertising poster showing the laughing cow. We'll come back to that by the time. As for the current story, Seron has expanded his cast of characters. The main character was Renaud, and so far the other characters around him had remained somewhat one-dimensional. That should change slowly. I have to spoil the end of the story a bit here, but after examining the little man who laughed and trying various healing methods, Dr. Honecker decides to move in with the little people for good. But of course that means he has to touch the meteor and shrink himself. But he accepts that because he is excited about the life that awaits him now. Here we are again with the motive of utopia. The world of the big ones has nothing more to offer Hondegger, so he moves on. In future stories, he will play an increasingly important role.
So there's that. With this story there was another main character integrated in the lore of the little people. And we will learn more about them soon. So see you next time.